the shapeshifter in the psyche. There is a figure that appears in every culture's mythology, in every tradition's stories, wearing different masks but playing the same essential role. He is Loki in Norse myth, Hermes in Greek, Anansi the spider in West African tales, Coyote in Native American tradition, the Joker in modern narratives. He breaks rules, crosses boundaries, creates chaos, and through his disruption, transforms everything he touches. This is the Trickster, and he is not merely a character in ancient stories. He is a living archetype in the human psyche, a force that operates in each of us whether we acknowledge him or not. The Trickster defies definition. He is neither good nor evil, neither hero nor villain. He serves his own purposes, follows no master, respects no authority. He lies and tells truth in the same breath. He destroys and creates simultaneously. He is the spirit of play, of chaos, of change, of the unexpected. And he is essential to psychological wholeness in ways that conventional morality and social order can never be. Carl Jung understood the Trickster as one of the fundamental archetypes, as old as consciousness itself. The Trickster represents the part of the psyche that refuses to be civilized, that will not conform, that finds life in disruption and meaning in paradox. Without the Trickster, we become rigid, bound by rules that no longer serve us, trapped in identities that have ossified, living lives of stifling order that slowly suffocate the soul. But the Trickster is dangerous. He can liberate or destroy, can bring creative renewal or devastating chaos, can be the agent of transformation or the architect of our downfall. Understanding the Trickster means understanding that not everything that disrupts is destructive, that not all chaos is meaningless, that sometimes what appears to be disorder is actually a higher form of order struggling to be born. The psychology of the Trickster is the study of how chaos serves consciousness, how rule-breaking enables growth, how play is not the opposite of seriousness but its necessary complement. The nature of the Trickster. Archetypal foundations. To understand the Trickster, we must first recognize that this is not simply a character type or a personality trait, but an archetype, a fundamental pattern in the collective unconscious that emerges across cultures, across time periods, across human experience with remarkable consistency. Jung identified archetypes as primordial images, as psychic structures inherited through our evolutionary and cultural history, as patterns that organize experience and generate meaning before we have conscious awareness of them. The Trickster appears in mythology with certain consistent characteristics. He is a boundary crosser, moving freely between worlds that are normally separated, heaven and earth, life and death, human and divine, order and chaos. Hermes guides souls to the underworld while also stealing Apollo's cattle. Loki shifts between being ally and enemy of the gods, between male and female form, between helper and destroyer. This boundary crossing is essential to the Trickster's nature. He exists in the liminal spaces, in the thresholds, in the places where categories break down and transformation becomes possible. The Trickster is also a shapeshifter, never fixed in a single form or identity. Anansi transforms into spider, man, and various animals. Loki becomes a fly, a seal, an old woman. This shape-shifting represents psychological flexibility, the capacity to adapt, to see from multiple perspectives, to refuse being trapped in a single identity. In a psyche dominated by the Trickster, nothing is permanent, nothing is sacred. Everything can be played with, transformed, reimagined. Across mythologies, the Trickster is associated with cleverness and cunning rather than brute strength. He defeats more powerful opponents through wit, through deception, through finding unconventional solutions. Odysseus, who embodies many Trickster qualities, defeats the Cyclops not through force but through linguistic trickery, calling himself nobody. The Trickster teaches that intelligence and creativity can overcome what appears to be superior power, that the weak can outwit the strong, that established order can be subverted by those clever enough to see its weaknesses. But the Trickster is not simply clever. He is amoral, operating outside conventional ethical frameworks. He lies, steals, breaks promises, violates taboos, yet he is not evil in the way we usually understand evil. His transgressions serve purposes beyond personal gain. In many myths, the trickster's theft or deception brings something essential to humanity. Prometheus, a trickster figure, steals fire from the gods and gives it to humans, an act of transgression that enables civilization. The trickster's rule-breaking is not simply destructive. It is creative destruction, tearing down what has become rigid to make space for new possibilities. The trickster is also associated with appetite, with the body, with the physical and instinctual aspects of existence that civilization tries to suppress. He is often depicted as hungry, lustful, driven by basic needs and desires. This connects the trickster to what Jung called the shadow, to the animal nature we deny in our attempts to be purely rational or spiritual. The trickster reminds us that we are bodies, that we have appetites, that the instinctual dimension of existence cannot be transcended without loss. In psychological terms, the trickster represents the part of the psyche that resists control, that will not be domesticated, that finds creative ways to express what has been repressed. When consciousness becomes too rigid, too ordered, too identified with persona and social role, the trickster emerges from the unconscious to disrupt, to create chaos, to force change. This can manifest as slips of the tongue that reveal what we really think, as accidents that express unconscious intentions, as sudden impulses that undermine our carefully constructed plans. Jung saw the trickster as closely related to the shadow, particularly to what he called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our personality. The trickster often expresses this inferior function in crude, disruptive ways. For the overly rational person, the trickster might emerge through chaotic emotions. For the overly ordered person, through impulsive actions. For the overly serious person, through inappropriate humor. The trickster compensates for one-sidedness, forcing us to confront what we have neglected. But the trickster is also connected to what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness, that includes both light and dark, both order and chaos. The trickster's boundary-crossing and shape-shifting point toward a consciousness that is not limited to any single identity, that can hold paradox, that embraces the full spectrum of human possibility. In this sense, the trickster is not just disruptive, but transformative, not just chaotic, but creative. The developmental psychologist Erik Erikson noted that the capacity for play, which the trickster embodies, is essential for healthy psychological development. Play is where we experiment with different roles, where we try out new possibilities, where we learn without the stakes being too high. The child who plays is practicing the trickster function, shape-shifting between identities, crossing boundaries, breaking rules in the protected space of play. Adults who have lost the capacity to play, who are entirely serious and literal, have lost access to the trickster energy that enables adaptation and creativity. The trickster also embodies what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the spirit of play, the lightness of being that can dance even in the face of suffering, that does not take itself too seriously, that knows that life is ultimately absurd and chooses laughter over despair. Nietzsche's Zarathustra speaks of three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel who bears burdens to lion who fights for freedom to child who plays. The child represents the highest development, the spirit that can create new values through play. This is the trickster's gift. In anthropological studies, the trickster often appears in ritual contexts at moments of transition, puberty rites, New Year celebrations, seasonal changes. These are threshold moments when the old order is giving way to the new, when transformation is happening. The trickster's chaos is necessary at these moments to break down what has been, so that what will be can emerge. Without the trickster's disruption, communities and individuals would become frozen, unable to adapt, trapped in forms that no longer serve life. The trickster is therefore not a primitive or childish archetype that we should outgrow. He is a necessary function in the psyche at all stages of development, at all levels of consciousness. He is the agent of change, the spirit of creativity, the force that prevents stagnation. Understanding the trickster means recognizing that chaos, play, rule-breaking, and disruption are not simply negative forces to be suppressed, but essential elements of a living, growing, adapting psyche. The trickster and the shadow, chaos as teacher. Carl Jung understood that the trickster is intimately connected to the shadow, that dark repository of everything we have disowned, everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. But the relationship between trickster and shadow is more complex than simple identification. The trickster is not simply the shadow. He is the shadow's messenger, its spokesperson, the force that brings what has been hidden into visibility through disruption and play. The shadow contains capacities we have rejected because they were deemed unacceptable. Our aggression, our selfishness, our sexuality, our irrationality, our chaos. But the shadow also contains gold, potentials we never developed, gifts we never claimed, aspects of ourselves that were suppressed, not because they were bad, but because they did not fit the narrow identity we or others chose for us. The trickster has access to both the dark and the golden shadow, and he brings both into consciousness through his disruptive interventions. When the trickster emerges from the unconscious, it is often because consciousness has become too one-sided, too identified with persona, too committed to a single way of being. The person who is excessively rational suddenly acts impulsively. The person who is always responsible suddenly becomes reckless. The person who maintains rigid control suddenly loses it entirely. These are not random breakdowns, but compensatory actions by the trickster, attempts to restore balance by forcing the excluded opposite into awareness. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites when they become too extreme. The trickster is the agent of enantiodromia, the force that ensures we cannot remain forever in one-sided consciousness, that pushes us toward wholeness, even when wholeness requires experiencing what we have spent our lives avoiding. Consider the person who's built their entire identity around being good, moral, responsible, controlled. They have pushed into the shadow everything that does not fit this image. Their anger, their wildness, their desire to break free from obligation. The shadow grows stronger through this denial, and eventually the trickster intervenes, perhaps through alcohol, which lowers inhibitions and allows the shadow to emerge, perhaps through an affair, which violates the carefully maintained moral identity, perhaps through a sudden abandonment of responsibilities, a flight from the life they have built. These trickster eruptions are often experienced as shameful, as evidence of hidden weakness or badness. But from a Jungian perspective, they are necessary correctives. The psyche's attempt to reintegrate what has been split off, to bring back into wholeness what has been exiled. The trickster's chaos is not random. It is purposeful, even if that purpose is not immediately visible to the conscious mind. The trickster also teaches through humor, which is itself a form of consciousness expansion. Humor requires seeing from multiple perspectives simultaneously, holding contradictions without collapsing into one or the other. The joke works because we see both the expected and the unexpected, both the rule and its violation, both the surface meaning and the hidden one. This capacity to hold paradox, to see multiple truths at once, is essential to psychological maturity and is one of the trickster's primary gifts. Sacred clowns in various indigenous traditions embody this teaching function of the trickster. During religious ceremonies, when the community is focused on the sacred and the serious, the sacred clown appears doing everything backwards, violating taboos, mocking what is revered. This is not sacrilege. It is a necessary balance, a reminder that the sacred becomes rigid when it cannot laugh at itself, that reverence without irreverence becomes oppressive, that consciousness needs both seriousness and play to remain healthy and flexible. The trickster also teaches by making fools of those who take themselves too seriously, who believe they have mastered life. who think they are beyond chaos and surprise. Pride, what the Greeks called hubris, is the trickster's favorite target. The successful person who becomes arrogant, the expert who becomes rigid in their expertise, the authority who forgets they are human. All of these attract the trickster's attention, and he teaches them through embarrassment or failure or scandal that they are not as in control as they believed, that chaos is always close, that the trickster can undo in a moment what took years to build. This teaching is not cruel, though it often feels that way. It is corrective. Hubris is dangerous because it separates us from our humanity, makes us believe we are gods rather than humans, creates blindness to our limitations and our shadow. The trickster's intervention, however painful, restores humility, reconnects us to our fallibility, reminds us that we are not the masters of existence but participants in forces larger than ourselves. The trickster also operates through what Freud called parapraxis, slips of the tongue or accidents that reveal unconscious truth. We say the opposite of what we intended, revealing what we really think. We forget an important meeting, revealing our ambivalence about it. We break something valuable, expressing unconscious anger. These are trickster moments, when the unconscious briefly takes control, bypassing the ego's censorship to express what has been repressed. Jung noticed that trickster energy often appears in analysis at crucial moments, when the patient is approaching important insights or making significant changes. Dreams become chaotic, unpredictable. The patient might miss sessions, might resist the work, might act out in ways that seem to undermine progress. But often, this apparent sabotage is actually preparation, the psyche creating chaos to break down old structures that must collapse before new ones can form. The alchemists, whose work Jung studied extensively, understood this principle. They knew that nigredo, the blackening, the stage of chaos and dissolution, was necessary before albedo, the whitening, the emergence of new order. The trickster presides over the nigredo, the necessary chaos that destroys what has become rigid so that transformation can occur. Without this dissolution, without this return to chaos, nothing truly new can emerge. We simply rearrange existing elements within existing patterns. The trickster teaches that chaos is not the enemy of order, but its necessary partner in a creative dance. Too much order becomes stagnation, becomes death in life, becomes systems that serve themselves rather than life. The trickster's chaos breaks these systems open, forces change, creates the conditions for renewal. This is why in many myths, the trickster is both destroyer and creator, both the one who breaks the world and the one who makes it new. But the trickster's teaching is not comfortable. It requires us to relinquish control, to accept that we are not the sole authors of our lives, to acknowledge that forces beyond ego consciousness shape our experience. It requires humility, flexibility, the capacity to laugh at ourselves, the willingness to play even when we think we should be serious. And it requires recognizing that what appears to be disruption may actually be the psyche's wisdom trying through indirect means to teach us what we refuse to learn directly. The mechanism of the trickster, how disruption transforms. The trickster operates through specific mechanisms that distinguish his disruption from mere chaos, his rule breaking from simple destruction. Understanding these mechanisms reveals how the trickster function actually facilitates psychological growth and cultural evolution, rather than simply undermining order. The primary mechanism is inversion, turning things upside down, reversing expected hierarchies and relationships. In medieval carnival traditions, which embody trickster energy, the beggar becomes king for a day, the priest is mocked, the powerful are humiliated. This temporary inversion serves crucial functions. It reveals that social hierarchies are constructed rather than natural, that authority is granted rather than inherent, that what seems fixed is actually fluid. This revelation creates psychological space for questioning, for imagining different arrangements, for recognizing that the way things are is not the way things must be. Psychologically, inversion allows us to see ourselves and our situations from new perspectives. The respected professional who experiences humiliation gains empathy for those they previously dismissed. The person who loses control discovers capacities they did not know they had when stripped of their usual supports. The Tricksters' inversions are temporary laboratories where we can try on different identities, see from different vantage points, discover what remains when our usual structures are removed. Another mechanism is boundary violation, the deliberate crossing of lines that are supposed to be uncrossable. The Trickster mixes categories that should remain separate: sacred and profane, truth and lies, male and female, human and animal, life and death. These violations are not random. They target the boundaries that have become too rigid, that have ossified into absolute distinctions when reality is actually more fluid and complex. In psychological terms, we all create boundaries to organize experience, to know what is me and what is not me, what is acceptable and what must be rejected. These boundaries are necessary for ego formation, for developing a coherent sense of self. But boundaries can become too rigid, excluding too much, creating a self that is too narrow, too defended, unable to adapt or grow. The Trickster violates these rigid boundaries, forcing us to encounter what we have excluded, challenging our certainties about what belongs inside and what must remain outside. Paradox is another primary mechanism. The Trickster embodies contradictions without resolving them. He is helper and hinderer, creator and destroyer, wise and foolish, friend and enemy. This is not inconsistency or confusion. It is a high form of consciousness that can hold opposites simultaneously without collapsing into either pole. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between opposites until a third thing emerges that includes both while being reducible to neither. The Trickster teaches us to tolerate paradox, to resist the premature closure that comes from choosing one side of a duality and rejecting the other. Life is paradoxical. We are both selfish and altruistic, both rational and irrational, both civilized and wild. When we can hold these paradoxes without needing to resolve them into simple either-or categories, we develop psychological complexity and flexibility. We become less rigid, less defensive, more capable of adapting to life's inherent ambiguity. Humor and play are also essential mechanisms through which the Trickster operates. Play creates a protected space where normal rules are suspended, where we can experiment without permanent consequences, where failure is not catastrophic. Children learn through play, trying on different roles, testing different behaviors, making mistakes that do not matter except as information. Adults who have lost the capacity to play have lost access to this experimental space, have become too identified with their roles, too afraid of failure to try anything new. The Trickster's humor often comes from revealing hidden truths that polite society conspires to ignore. The child in the fairy tale who announces that the emperor has no clothes is playing the Trickster role, stating the obvious that everyone else has agreed not to see. This humor is subversive because it breaks the social contract of shared denial, because it names what should not be named, because it makes visible what power requires to remain invisible. Timing is crucial to how the Trickster operates. He appears at thresholds, at moments of transition, when old forms are dying and new forms are struggling to be born. These liminal moments are dangerous because the usual structures do not apply, because we are between identities, between worlds, between one way of being and another. The Trickster's presence during these thresholds is not accidental. His chaos is necessary to complete the dissolution of old forms and to catalyze the emergence of new ones. In individual developments, the Trickster often appears during midlife transitions, during identity crises, during moments when we must let go of who we have been to become who we are meant to be. The chaos he brings, the disruption of plans and identities, feels catastrophic in the moment. But in retrospect, these chaotic periods are often when the most significant growth occurred, when we were forced to change in ways we would never have chosen consciously, but which were necessary for our development. The Trickster also operates through what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to have intention but no causal explanation. We are thinking about someone, and they call. We need particular information, and it appears through unlikely channels. We are at a crossroads, and random events seem to push us in a particular direction. These synchronicities often have a trickster quality, playful and profound simultaneously, disrupting our belief that we are in control while suggesting that something larger is orchestrating events. The mechanism of revelation through concealment is also characteristic of the trickster. He hides truth in lies, wisdom in foolishness, serious meaning in playful form. The court jester could tell the king truths that would get anyone else executed because the truths were wrapped in jokes, in performances, in the protected space of play. The trickster teaches that sometimes truth can only be heard when it comes indirect, when it sneaks past our defenses disguised as something harmless. This mechanism operates in therapy, in art, in storytelling. We can face difficult truths about ourselves when they are presented in fictional form, when they appear in someone else's story, when they emerge through metaphor rather than direct confrontation. The trickster knows that consciousness has defenses, that ego will reject what threatens it, that transformation often requires approaching truth sideways, through play and story and symbol, rather than through direct assault. The trickster also operates through escalation and excess, pushing things to extremes where they reveal their true nature or break down entirely. The person who is always controlled becomes more and more rigid until the control becomes its own prison and finally shatters. The social system that is based on lies maintains those lies with increasing effort until the effort itself becomes unsustainable and the system collapses. The trickster accelerates these processes, makes them more visible, brings them to their crisis point where transformation becomes possible. Understanding these mechanisms helps us recognize when the trickster is at work in our lives and in our culture, helps us distinguish his creative chaos from mere destruction, helps us work with rather than against the transformative disruption he brings. The trickster and identity, playing with boundaries. The trickster's most profound challenge is to the very notion of fixed identity. In a world that demands we know who we are, that insists on consistency, that punishes shape-shifting as inauthentic, the trickster asks, what if identity itself is a kind of trick, a necessary fiction, a game we play so seriously that we forget we are playing? The existentialists grappled with this question from a different angle. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, that we have no fixed essence, that we create ourselves through our choices. But most people flee from this freedom into what he called bad faith, pretending to be fixed things rather than free beings. We say, I'm a teacher, I'm a parent, I'm an introvert, as if these were facts about our being rather than roles we have chosen, identities we have constructed and could, theoretically, construct differently. The trickster embodies radical freedom from fixed identity. He is never one thing. He shifts, he adapts, he plays different roles without being trapped in any of them. This is not schizophrenia or fragmentation. It is fluidity, the recognition that we contain multitudes, that identity is performed rather than discovered, that who we are is always a work in progress rather than a settled fact. This fluidity threatens social order because social order depends on predictable identities. If people can shift their identities at will, if commitments are temporary, if roles are performances that can be dropped, then the social contract becomes unstable. Society needs to know who people are, needs them to stay in their assigned categories, needs them to be consistent and predictable. The trickster's shape-shifting violates this need, creates anxiety, threatens the certainty that makes social cooperation possible. But psychological health requires some of this trickster fluidity. The person who is completely identified with a single role, who has no distance from their identity, who believes they are their persona rather than wearing it, this person is psychologically brittle. When circumstances change, when the role is no longer available, when the identity can no longer be maintained, they experience not just loss but existential crisis. Who am I if I am not this? The Trickster teaches that we can play roles without being the roles, can inhabit identities without being imprisoned by them, can be serious about our commitments, while maintaining an awareness that all identities are ultimately provisional. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of wearing one's virtues lightly, of being able to take them off as one takes off a costume. The person who can do this has achieved a higher form of consciousness, one that includes and transcends particular identities. Gender provides a particularly rich domain for exploring the trickster's relationship to identity. Many trickster figures across mythology are gender fluid. Loki becomes female to seduce and deceive. Hermes partakes of both masculine and feminine qualities. Indigenous tricksters often shift between genders or embody both simultaneously. This gender fluidity is not incidental. It represents the trickster's refusal to be bound by the most fundamental category that society imposes, the division between male and female. Psychologically, Jung argued that we all contain both masculine and feminine aspects, what he called animus and anima. Healthy development requires integrating both rather than completely identifying with the gender assigned to our biological sex. The trickster facilitates this integration by crossing gender boundaries, by revealing that masculine and feminine are not absolute opposites, but polarities that can be held together, played with, combined in infinite variations. The trickster also challenges the boundary between self and other, between individual and collective. Through his boundary crossing, through his shape-shifting, he suggests that the self is not a sealed container but a permeable process, that we are constantly being shaped by and shaping our relationships and environments, that identity is relational rather than intrinsic. This is a more Buddhist or ecological understanding of self, one that sees the individual as a node in a network rather than as an isolated entity. This understanding threatens Western individualism, which is built on the fiction of the autonomous self, the person who is self-made, who owns their identity, who exists independent of relationships and contexts. The trickster reveals this fiction by showing how easily identities can be swapped, how much of who we are depends on social recognition, how permeable the boundaries of the self actually are. Authenticity becomes more complex in the trickster's domain. Conventional morality tells us to be authentic, to be ourselves, to remain true to who we are. But the trickster asks, which self? We contain many selves, many possible identities. Being authentic might mean having the flexibility to shift between them, to be one way in this context and another way in that context, not because we are inauthentic, but because different situations call forth different aspects of our multiplicity. This is not the same as having no core, no values, no commitments. It is recognizing that the core itself is multiple, that our values can be held playfully while still being held seriously, that commitment does not require rigidity. The trickster shows us how to be fully engaged while remaining free, how to play our roles with complete dedication while knowing they are roles, how to take life seriously without taking ourselves too seriously. The concept of the persona, which Jung borrowed from the Greek word for mask, is essentially trickster territory. The persona is the face we show to the world, the role we play in social interactions. Problems arise when we identify completely with the persona, forgetting that it is a mask, believing that it is who we actually are. But problems also arise when we reject the persona entirely, refusing to play social roles, insisting on being our raw, authentic selves in all contexts regardless of appropriateness. The trickster teaches a middle way. Wear the mask consciously, play the role skillfully, but maintain awareness that you are not the mask, that you can take it off, that you contain more than any single role can express. This conscious role-playing is not inauthentic. It is a sophisticated form of authenticity that acknowledges the theatrical dimension of all social existence while maintaining integrity. The shadow side of trickster identity play is the con artist, the person who uses shape-shifting purely for manipulation, who has no core self beneath the masks, who who experiences identity as pure performance with nothing authentic underlying it. This is what Jung called inflation by the trickster archetype, when a person becomes possessed by trickster energy without any grounding in genuine self-knowledge or moral commitment. The integrated trickster, by contrast, plays with identity from a secure center, uses flexibility in service of growth and creativity rather than exploitation, knows when to be fluid and when to be solid, when to cross boundaries and when to respect them. This integration requires both the ego strength to maintain coherence and the flexibility to avoid rigidity, both commitment to values and playfulness with their expression. The psychology and neuroscience of play and deception. Modern psychology and neuroscience have begun to map the cognitive and neural architecture underlying the trickster's primary activities: play, deception, creativity, and the ability to shift between perspectives. What we discover reveals that these capacities are not peripheral to human cognition, but central to our evolutionary success and psychological health. Play is a universal mammalian behavior, particularly pronounced in species with large brains and extended childhoods. Neuroscientist Jacques Panksepp identified play as one of the 7 primary emotional systems in the mammalian brain, as fundamental as fear or rage or seeking. Play activates specific neural circuits in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, creating states of joy and engagement that are intrinsically rewarding. Animals play not because it serves some ulterior purpose, but because the brain finds play inherently pleasurable. But play also serves crucial developmental functions. Through play, young animals and humans practice skills they will need, experiment with social roles, learn to navigate hierarchies and conflicts, develop creativity and problem-solving abilities. Play creates a protected space where mistakes are not catastrophic, where rules can be invented and revised, where reality can be manipulated and transformed. This is precisely the space the trickster inhabits and creates. Research on creativity reveals that it depends on the brain's ability to make unexpected connections, to see relationships between things that are normally kept separate, to break out of established categories and patterns. Brain imaging shows that creative insight involves a shift from focused, analytical processing in the left hemisphere to more diffuse, associative processing in the right hemisphere, followed by integration of both. This is a kind of neural boundary crossing, analogous to the trickster's mythological boundary violations. The capacity for deception, which the trickster embodies, is cognitively complex and evolutionarily significant. To deceive effectively requires theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have beliefs and perspectives different from one's own, and that these beliefs can be manipulated. Research shows that theory of mind depends on specific regions of the prefrontal cortex, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction. Children develop deception capacities around age 4, precisely when theory of mind matures. The ability to lie, to pretend, to imagine what others are thinking, all emerge together as a developmental package. This is not moral corruption but cognitive sophistication. The child who can lie has achieved a crucial milestone: the recognition that reality and representation can diverge, that what is true and what appears to be true are not the same thing. Psychopaths, who might seem like pure tricksters with their skilled deception and lack of emotional constraint, actually reveal the limits of trickster functioning. Brain imaging shows that psychopaths have reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, between cognitive understanding and emotional response. They can understand deception cognitively but lack the emotional grounding that would make their shape-shifting serve purposes beyond pure self-interest. They are tricksters without the trickster's ultimately transformative and creative function. The neuroscience of humor, which is central to trickster energy, reveals that joke comprehension requires rapid cognitive shifting. The brain must process the expected meaning, recognize the violation or incongruity, and then reframe to see the unexpected meaning. This happens in milliseconds, involving coordination between language areas, prefrontal regions that detect incongruity, and reward centers that generate the pleasure of getting the joke. Humor is a form of cognitive play, a demonstration of mental flexibility. Research on cognitive flexibility shows that people vary in their ability to shift between perspectives, to adopt different frames, to see multiple meanings simultaneously. Those with rigid cognitive styles, measured by tests of set shifting and reversal learning, struggle with ambiguity and change. Those with flexible cognitive styles handle uncertainty better, adapt to new situations more easily, generate more creative solutions. This flexibility is the neural foundation of trickster consciousness. The neurotransmitter dopamine plays a crucial role in novelty-seeking and exploratory behavior, in the willingness to take risks and try new things. Individual differences in dopamine system functioning predict how much people seek out novel experiences, how comfortable they are with uncertainty, how quickly they become bored with routine. The trickster personality, in neural terms, likely involves a dopamine system that is highly responsive to novelty and resistant to habituation. But the trickster also requires prefrontal control. Pure impulsivity, acting on every urge without consideration of consequences, is not trickster behavior. The trickster's rule-breaking is strategic, his chaos is directed, his disruption serves purposes. This requires intact executive function, the ability to plan, to inhibit automatic responses when necessary, to consider alternatives. The trickster walks a narrow path between too much control, which becomes rigidity, and too little control, which becomes mere impulsivity. Research on improvisational performance, which embodies many trickster qualities, shows that successful improvisation requires both spontaneity and structure. Brain imaging of jazz musicians during improvisation reveals increased activity in medial prefrontal areas associated with self-expression, and decreased activity in dorsolateral prefrontal areas associated with self-monitoring and inhibition. The brain relaxes conscious control while maintaining enough structure to create coherent music rather than random noise. This is the neural pattern of healthy trickster function: relaxed control that allows spontaneity while maintaining enough coherence to create meaningful rather than chaotic output. The person who has integrated a trickster can improvise, can respond creatively to unexpected circumstances, can shift between frames without becoming fragmented or losing their center. Developmental neuroscience reveals that play behavior peaks during periods of intense brain growth and synaptic pruning. Play is not just entertainment for developing brains. It is how the brain explores possibilities, tests different configurations, learns what works. The child who is prevented from playing, who is forced into rigid routines and roles too early, may develop neural architecture that is less flexible, less creative, less capable of adapting to novelty. Adult brains retain plasticity, retain the capacity for play and creative reconfiguration, but this capacity must be actively maintained. Adults who never play, who are always serious, who rigidly maintain routines, may be allowing their neural architecture to become progressively less flexible. The trickster's insistence on play is not regression, but maintenance of cognitive flexibility throughout the lifespan. Mirror neurons, which fire both when we perform an action and when we observe others performing it, are crucial for the trickster's shape-shifting abilities. To convincingly adopt another's perspective, to play another's role, we must be able to internally simulate their experience. Mirror neurons provide this simulation capacity. They allow us to try on other identities, to feel our way into other perspectives, to understand from the inside how it feels to be someone else. The trickster's capacity for perspective shifting has adaptive value beyond individual development. In groups and cultures, trickster figures serve as cognitive diversity, as the voice that questions consensus, as the perspective that sees what groupthink misses. Neuroscience shows that groups, like individuals, can become cognitively rigid, can get stuck in established patterns. The trickster function, whether embodied in particular individuals or distributed across group members, provides the cognitive flexibility that allows groups to adapt, to reconsider assumptions, to change course when necessary. Beyond the trickster, integration and creative chaos. If the trickster is essential to psychological wholeness, if his chaos serves consciousness, if his disruption enables transformation, then how do we work with this archetype consciously? How do we integrate trickster energy without being possessed by it, without becoming the con artist or the perpetual rebel, without losing the necessary order that makes coherent life possible? The path of integration begins with recognition. We must learn to identify when the trickster is active in our lives, when the disruption we are experiencing or creating serves a transformative purpose, and when it is merely destructive. This requires developing what Jung called psychological literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language of the psyche, to recognize archetypal patterns as they manifest in everyday life. Trickster moments have a particular quality. Things go wrong in ways that seem almost intentional. We miss important appointments for no clear reason. We say exactly the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Plans that seemed solid fall apart through unlikely coincidences. Equipment malfunctions at crucial times. These events, frustrating as they are, often redirect us towards something we were avoiding or reveal something we were not seeing. The trickster's chaos is rarely random. It has purpose, even when that purpose is not immediately visible. Learning to ask what the trickster might be trying to teach us transforms our relationship to disruption. Instead of simply fighting the chaos, trying to reimpose control, we can pause and ask, what pattern is being broken? What rigidity is being challenged? What new possibility is trying to emerge through this disruption? These questions do not mean passively accepting all chaos. They mean approaching it with curiosity rather than only resistance. Integration also requires developing the capacity to play, to not take ourselves so seriously, to maintain humor even in difficulty. The person who has integrated the trickster can laugh at themselves, can see the absurdity in their own pretensions, can hold their commitment seriously while recognizing the ultimately playful nature of existence. This is not cynicism or nihilism. It is perspective, the ability to zoom out and see the cosmic comedy in which we are all participants. But integration must be balanced. The trickster integrated is not the trickster unleashed. We need both order and chaos, both structure and spontaneity, both commitment and flexibility. The person who is all trickster becomes unreliable, becomes incapable of sustained effort, becomes a permanent adolescent who can never commit to anything because commitment feels like imprisonment. This is not integration but identification, being possessed by the archetype rather than consciously working with it. The Senex, the archetype of the wise elder, who represents order, structure, tradition, and discipline, is the trickster's necessary opposite. Psychological wholeness requires both. We need a Senex to build, to preserve, to maintain structures that protect and sustain life. We need a trickster to question, to disrupt, to prevent those structures from becoming prisons. The dance between Senex and trickster, between order and chaos, creates the dynamic stability in which growth becomes possible. Timing is crucial in working with trickster energy. There are moments when disruption is needed, when rigid structures must be broken, when chaos serves transformation. But there are also moments when what is needed is consolidation, stability, the patient work of building and maintaining. The wisdom is knowing which moment is which, knowing when to invoke the trickster and when to resist him. Midlife transitions often call for trickster energy. The structures that served in the first half of life, the identities that worked, the commitments that made sense, these often need to be questioned and perhaps abandoned or transformed in the second half. The trickster's disruption at midlife, which might manifest as crisis, as impulse to radical change, as questioning of everything, this serves the individuation process, the movement toward wholeness that Jung saw as the central task of the second half of life. But the trickster must eventually serve the self, the archetype of wholeness. The disruption is not an end in itself, but a means toward integration. The boundaries that the trickster crosses, the categories he mixes, the opposites he holds together, all of this points toward a consciousness that is more inclusive, more flexible, more capable of holding complexity and paradox. This is the trickster's ultimate gift. Not chaos, but a higher order that includes chaos. Creative work requires trickster energy. The artist, the innovator, the person who brings something genuinely new into the world must be willing to cross boundaries, to combine what has been kept separate, to see possibilities that conventional thinking misses. But creativity also requires discipline, requires the cynic's energy to give form to the trickster's inspiration, to sustain effort over time, to bring the creative vision into actual manifestation. The creative process itself often follows a trickster pattern. It begins with play, with exploration, with trying things without knowing where they will lead. Then comes chaos, the period when nothing works, when the vision cannot be realized, when failure seems inevitable. But this chaos, if we can tolerate it without fleeing, often gives birth to breakthrough, to the unexpected solution, to the emergence of something that could not have been planned or predicted. The trickster presides over this chaotic middle, this fertile void where the new is gestating. Culturally, we need trickster voices, people who question consensus, who reveal what power once hidden, who speak uncomfortable truths, who use humor to challenge authority. Every healthy culture contains both conservative and disruptive forces, both those who preserve tradition and those who question it. When the trickster voices are suppressed, when everyone is required to conform, when questioning is punished, cultures become rigid, unable to adapt, vulnerable to catastrophic collapse when circumstances change. But a trickster must also be contained within some framework. Pure chaos, the complete absence of structure and limit, is not creative but destructive. The sacred clown in indigenous traditions operates within a ceremonial context. The court jester serves the king even while mocking him. The artist who breaks aesthetic rules still produces something, still creates form, even if it is unconventional form. The trickster needs boundaries to cross, rules to break, structure to disrupt. Without these, his chaos becomes meaningless. Personal integration of the trickster therefore means developing the capacity to shift between modes, to be structured when structure serves, and spontaneous when spontaneity serves. To play with commitment rather than refusing all commitment. To hold identity lightly while still having integrity. This is sophisticated consciousness, consciousness that can hold paradox, that does not collapse into either rigid order or chaotic dissolution but maintains creative tension between the two. Conclusion. The psychology of the trickster reveals one of the great paradoxes of human consciousness. We need chaos to remain healthy. We need disruption to grow. We need rule breaking to discover new rules. We need play to do serious work. The trickster is not an aberration in the psyche but an essential function, as necessary as order, as important as discipline, as valuable as commitment. Without the trickster, we become rigid, trapped in identities that no longer serve us, bound by rules that have outlived their purpose, imprisoned in structures that protect nothing but their own perpetuation. We lose creativity, lose adaptability, lose the flexibility necessary to navigate a changing world. We become the systems we created, rather than the living beings those systems were meant to serve. But the trickster unleashed, the trickster unintegrated, is equally dangerous. Pure chaos destroys without creating. Constant disruption makes sustained effort impossible. Perpetual shape-shifting prevents the formation of stable identity and meaningful relationships. The person possessed by the trickster becomes unreliable, becomes incapable of commitment, becomes a permanent outsider who can criticize but never build. Integration is the path between these extremes. The integrated trickster is not eliminated but consciously engaged, not suppressed but understood, not fought but danced with. We learn to recognize when trickster energy is needed, when the structures in our lives have become too rigid, when our identities have become too fixed, when our seriousness has become suffocating. And we learn to invoke the trickster deliberately, through play, through humor, through questioning our assumptions, through experimenting with different perspectives. We also learn when to resist a trickster, when his disruption would be destructive rather than creative, when what is needed is stability rather than change, when commitment must be honored even when it feels constraining. This discrimination, this wisdom about when to embrace chaos and when to maintain order is the fruit of psychological maturity. The Trickster teaches that life is ultimately playful, that existence is a cosmic game, that taking ourselves too seriously is a kind of blindness. But this teaching is not permission for irresponsibility or nihilism. It is an invitation to hold our commitments seriously while remembering they are commitments we have chosen, roles we have adopted, identities we have constructed and could, theoretically, construct differently. The Trickster shows us that boundaries are more fluid than we imagine, that categories are constructed rather than given, that what seems fixed is actually changeable. This recognition can be liberating or terrifying depending on how we meet it. If we cling to certainty, if we need the world to be stable and predictable, the Trickster's revelations feel like assault. But if we can embrace uncertainty, if we can tolerate ambiguity, the Trickster's gift is freedom, is creativity, is the capacity to adapt and grow. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires integrating all the archetypes, including the Trickster. We cannot become whole by being only good, only ordered, only serious, only committed. We must also include the chaos, the play, the rule breaking, the boundary crossing that the Trickster represents. This inclusion does not mean acting on every Trickster impulse. It means having conscious relationship with these energies, recognizing them as parts of ourselves rather than as alien forces to be suppressed. The Trickster appears when consciousness has become too one-sided, when we have identified too completely with order or rationality or persona. His chaos is compensatory, is the psyche's attempt to restore balance. When we can recognize this, when we can see the wisdom in what appears to be disruption, we transform our relationship to change, to uncertainty, to the unexpected turns that life inevitably brings. We are not meant to become tricksters. We are meant to integrate the Trickster, to include his flexibility and playfulness and creativity while maintaining the structure and commitment that makes sustained life possible. This integration is itself a kind of play, a dance between opposites, a creative engagement with the full spectrum of human possibility. The Trickster reminds us that we are not our roles, not our identities, not our personas, that beneath all the masks and performances lives something more fluid, more free, more capable of transformation than our everyday consciousness usually acknowledges. And in that recognition lies both danger and liberation, both the dissolution of false certainty and the discovery of authentic freedom. If this exploration of the Trickster has helped you recognize this energy in your own life, if you see moments when chaos served transformation or when rigidity needed disruption, then you have begun the work of conscious relationship with this archetype. The Trickster is not other. He is part of you, waiting to be recognized and integrated. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores the archetypal dimensions of human psychology, that honors both ancient wisdom and modern understanding, that invites you to see yourself and your experience through the lens of depth psychology. Share this with someone who needs permission to play, who has become too rigid, who might benefit from understanding that chaos sometimes serves growth. Leave a comment sharing your own encounters with the Trickster, moments when disruption revealed something important, times when humor or play opened new possibilities, instances when crossing boundaries led to insight. This community exists for those willing to explore the full depth and breadth of human psychology, including the uncomfortable, chaotic, playful dimensions that conventional psychology often ignores. Remember, you contain both order and chaos, both structure and spontaneity, both commitment and freedom. The question is not whether to be one or the other, but how to dance between them, how to know when each is needed, how to integrate rather than choose. The Trickster teaches this dance. Honor his lessons. Play with your identities. Question your certainties. Laugh at your pretensions. Cross boundaries when boundaries have become prisons. But also remember, the Trickster serves wholeness, not chaos for its own sake. His disruption is purposeful. His play is serious. His boundary crossing points toward integration. Work with him consciously. Dance with him rather than being possessed by him. And discover that chaos, when consciously engaged, is not the enemy of order, but its creative partner in the great work of becoming fully human.